The morning sunlight filtered through the sheer curtains of our living room, bathing the space in a warm, golden hue. I sipped my coffee, its heat soothing my hands, and listened to the faint sounds of movement upstairs. William, my nephew, had always been an early riser. At 20, he was a whirlwind of energy, curiosity, and ambition, qualities I envied as I entered my 60s. When Julia, my younger sister, and her son moved in after her divorce, I welcomed them wholeheartedly. Our house became a sanctuary for three souls navigating life's uncertainties. Andrew, my husband of nearly 40 years, spent most of his time in his study, lost in books or correspondence. Our bond, once fiery, had dimmed to a quiet companionship. William had inherited his father's stature, tall and broad-shouldered, and Julia's dark, intense eyes. His presence filled the room, even when he wasn't speaking. Over the past year, we had spent countless evenings in my home office, where he sought advice about his struggles with his mother and his place in the world. I was a psychologist by trade and had dedicated my career to understanding the human mind. Yet, when it came to William, I found myself grappling with thoughts and feelings I couldn't articulate. "Morning, Aunt Ruby," William greeted me, his deep voice breaking my reverie. He stood in the doorway, a picture of youth and vitality in his athletic wear, his dark hair still damp from his morning run. "Good morning, William," I replied, forcing a smile and setting down my mug. "You're up early." "Habit, I guess," he said, his lips curving into a boyish grin. "Besides, it's hard to stay in bed knowing you make the best coffee in the house." I laughed softly, trying to suppress the warmth rising to my cheeks. He had a way of making the simplest compliments sound profound. That evening we found ourselves in my office again. William sat across from me, his posture relaxed yet attentive. He had started confiding in me more frequently, sharing the frustrations of a young man caught between his mother's expectations and his desire for independence. "I don't know if I'm cut out for what Mom wants," he admitted, running a hand through his hair. "It's like she sees me as this version of myself that I'm not sure I can be." "Have you told her this?" asked gently. He shook his head, his expression pensive. "She wouldn't understand. But you always do." There it was again, that unspoken connection that seemed to tether us in ways I couldn't fully understand. His gaze lingered on mine, searching, as if he saw beyond the professional facade I tried so hard to maintain. "Thank you," he said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper, "for always being here. For listening." "Always," I replied, my throat tightening. He reached across the desk, his hand brushing mine. The contact was fleeting, yet it left an indelible impression, like the faint trail of a comet in the night sky. Days turned into weeks, and our conversations grew deeper, more intimate. William started spending more time in my company than with his mother. Julia, bless her heart, chalked it up to our shared love of literature and psychology. She never suspected the undercurrent that flowed between her son and me. One evening, as we sat in the garden, William turned to me, his expression uncharacteristically vulnerable. "Aunt Ruby, do you ever feel like you're living someone else's life?" The question startled me. "Sometimes," I admitted. "Why do you ask?" He hesitated, his gaze fixed on the stars above. "Because when I'm with you, it feels like I'm finally myself." His words hung in the air, heavy with implication. I didn't dare respond, afraid of what might spill out if I did. Instead I stood, excusing myself under the pretense of needing more tea. But as I walked back inside, my heart betrayed me with its hurried rhythm, and I knew our story was just beginning. It had been a quiet Sunday afternoon. Julia had taken a rare day for herself, visiting friends out of town. Andrew, as usual, had retreated to his study, his world reduced to the endless drone of historical documentaries. The house was ours, an unspoken opportunity to steal a moment of solitude. William knocked lightly on the doorframe of my office before stepping in, the ease in his movements replaced by a noticeable tension. He was dressed in his usual casual attire, jeans and a plain white shirt, but the look in his dark eyes was anything but casual. It was as though he had wrestled with a storm before walking into the room. "Do you have a minute?" he asked. I nodded, closing my book and gesturing for him to sit across from me. His visits to my office had become frequent, a sanctuary for both of us. "I need to say something," he began, his voice low and uncertain, a rare break from his usual confidence. "I don't know how else to do this except to just say it." I leaned forward slightly, my chest tightening. Go on, William. Whatever it is, I'm listening. He looked down, his hands clasped together before meeting my gaze. I think about you all the time. And not the way I'm supposed to. The room seemed to shrink, the air thickening between us. His words were suspended in the silence that followed, waiting for me to react. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. The honesty in his confession caught me off guard, even though a part of me had known. Had felt this moment building like a wave about to crest. William, I said finally, my voice barely audible. This we can't. It's impossible. But it doesn't feel impossible, he said, standing abruptly, pacing the length of the room. I've tried to push it away, but I can't. You're all I think about, Ruby. The way he said my name, without the familial aunt that had always preceded it, sent a tremor through me. I stood too, needing the distance, needing to keep the walls I had so carefully built intact. You're young, William, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. You're confused and... I'm not confused, he interrupted, stepping closer. I've never been more certain of anything in my life. I turned away, desperate to gather my thoughts. This wasn't just about him. It was about me too. About the warmth that spread through me whenever he was near, the way his presence filled the empty spaces of my life I hadn't even realized existed. Ruby, he said softly, and I felt his hand on my arm, firm but gentle. Please, just look at me. I did. His eyes, so much like Julia's, yet wholly his own, held mine with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. And then, before I could stop him, he leaned in. His lips brushed against mine, tentative at first. For a moment I didn't move. It was a kiss that could have been dismissed as a misunderstanding, an accidental crossing of boundaries. But then instinct took over. My hands found his chest, and I pushed him back, breathless. William, no, I said, shaking my head. This isn't right. He looked at me, his face a mixture of hope and despair. Tell me you didn't feel that. I couldn't lie to him or to myself. Instead, I turned away, my hands trembling as I braced myself against the desk. We can't, I whispered. But we already have, he said, his voice steady. And I don't regret it. The days that followed were a blur of avoidance and stolen glances. We both knew the line we had crossed, and yet neither of us could bring ourselves to fully retreat. It was as though the kiss had awakened something neither of us could suppress, no matter how hard we tried. One evening, while the house was quiet again, I found myself sitting in my office, trying to lose myself in paperwork. But then there was a knock on the door and he was there. Can we talk? He asked. I nodded, my heart already racing. He closed the door behind him, the click of the lock sending a jolt through me. I'm sorry, he began. I'm sorry if I've made things harder for you. It's not just you, William, I admitted, my voice trembling. I've tried to ignore it, but I can't. The confession hung in the air, raw and unfiltered. He stepped closer, his hand brushing mine. This time I didn't pull away. When his arms wrapped around me, it felt like a dam breaking. We held each other tightly, the rest of the world fading away. I don't want to hide how I feel, he murmured against my hair. We have to, I replied, pulling back just enough to look at him. No one can know. His lips found mine again, this time with a fervor that matched the ache we had both been suppressing. The kiss was slow, deliberate, as though we were both memorizing every second. It wasn't just desire. It was the culmination of every stolen glance, every unspoken word, every moment of restraint. When we finally pulled away, I rested my forehead against his, our breaths mingling in the quiet of the room. This has to stay between us, I whispered. He nodded, his eyes soft but resolute. I will. I promise. And so began our secret, one we would hide in the corners of my office, in the stolen moments when no one was looking, knowing all the while that the truth had the power to unravel everything. Days turned into weeks, and life within our shared home resumed its rhythm, or at least the appearance of it. Julia remained blissfully unaware, engrossed in her own world of work and hobbies. Andrew kept to his books and documentaries, a shadow of the vibrant man I had married decades ago. Yet, beneath the veneer of normalcy, the dynamic between William and me had irrevocably shifted. We were careful, oh so careful, to keep our secret hidden. When our hands brushed at the dinner table, or when William lingered too long in the kitchen under the pretense of helping me clean up, we ensured no one noticed. But in private, the walls of my office became our sanctuary. It was a rainy evening when our carefully constructed routine cracked under the weight of unspoken longing. Andrew had gone to bed early, as was his habit, and Julia was out meeting friends. I was sitting in my office, the rain tapping against the window, when William appeared at the door. "May I come in?" he asked, his voice low, his dark eyes intense. I nodded, though the warning bells in my head clamored for attention. He closed the door behind him and leaned against it, his hands in his pockets. The way his shirt clung to his shoulders, damp from the rain, made my breath hitch. "We're alone," he said, taking a tentative step closer. "William," I began, my voice faltering. "You can tell me to leave," he said quickly, cutting me off. "But I needed to see you. Just to be near you." The storm outside seemed to mirror the one within me. His presence filled the room, and I felt the pull, the magnetic force that made resisting him impossible. I stood, my legs unsteady, and moved to the window, keeping my back to him. "This is dangerous," I whispered, my breath fogging the glass. "What we're doing, it could destroy everything." "Then why does it feel so right?" he asked, and I felt his warmth behind me before he even touched me. When his hands settled lightly on my shoulders, I didn't move. My resolve, so strong in the light of day, crumbled in the intimacy of the moment. Slowly I turned to face him, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. "William, we can't keep," my words died as he cupped my face, his touch gentle, reverent. "I know I'm not supposed to feel this way," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "But I do. And I think you do too." I closed my eyes, the truth of his words cutting through the chaos of my thoughts. When I opened them, he was closer, his gaze searching mine for permission. And then, as if pulled by some unseen force, our lips met. The kiss that followed was nothing like the hesitant, testing ones we had shared before. It was a collision of everything we had been holding back: desire, fear, longing. His arms wrapped around me, pulling me against him, and for a moment, the rest of the world ceased to exist. When we finally pulled away, breathless, I stepped back, my fingers trembling as they brushed my lips. "This is madness," I said, though the words lacked conviction. "It's us," William countered, his eyes burning with intensity. "And I don't want to stop." Neither did I. As much as my rational mind screamed for me to end this now, to send him away, my heart, no, my very soul, refused. And so, our affair continued, hidden in plain sight. My office became our refuge, where stolen moments stretched into hours. The stolen kisses, the lingering touches, the whispered confessions, they became the lifeblood of a connection that neither of us could sever. The weight of our secret began to seep into every aspect of my life. I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often, my heart leaping at every sudden knock or sound. Julia's obliviousness provided little solace, for her trust in me made the betrayal sting all the more. "You've been quiet lately," she remarked one afternoon as we prepared lunch together. "Just busy with work," I replied, forcing a smile. "And with William," she teased lightly, nudging me. "He's always in your office these days. I'm glad he feels comfortable talking to you." Her words, meant as praise, felt like a knife twisting in my chest. I wanted to tell her the truth, to unburden myself, but I couldn't risk shattering her world, or ours. Later that evening, William found me in the kitchen. He leaned against the counter, watching me as I cleaned up. "You look tired," he said, his voice soft with concern. "It's the weight of what we're doing," I admitted. "I can't keep pretending this doesn't affect me." He moved closer, his hand covering mine as I gripped the edge of the sink. "We'll figure it out," he said. "Together." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that this, whatever it was, could exist without unraveling everything. But deep down, I knew we were walking a razor's edge. Our first close call came one sunny afternoon when Julia returned home unexpectedly. William and I were in the office, the door closed, our conversation interspersed with fleeting touches. "I think I hear someone," I whispered, pulling away. His hand lingered on mine. "It's probably nothing." But the sound of the front door closing froze us both. Julia's voice called out, "Ruby." "William." I pushed him toward the bookshelf. "Oh, hide." He slipped out through the side door, his movements quiet and practiced. Moments later, Julia appeared in the doorway, a bag of groceries in hand. "There you are," she said with a smile. "I brought some things for dinner. What are you working on?" "Just some old case notes," I lied, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. She lingered for a moment before nodding. All right. Don't work too hard. When she left, I sank into my chair, my head in my hands. William returned a moment later, his expression apologetic. We can't keep doing this, I said, my voice breaking. But when he pulled me into his arms, the fear and guilt melted away, leaving only the undeniable truth of what we were becoming. It happened on a late spring evening, the kind of night when the air is warm and heavy, promising summer's arrival. The house was quiet, Julia having stepped out to visit a friend, and Andrew presumed to be asleep in his study. William and I had retreated to the office, a sanctuary that had borne witness to countless whispered confessions and stolen kisses. I sat on the edge of the desk, my legs crossed, while William leaned against the door, his arms folded. The tension between us, always electric, had built to an unbearable crescendo. I hate sneaking around like this, he murmured, moving closer. I know, I admitted. But it's the only way. His hand brushed mine, and in an instant we were in each other's arms. His lips met mine, the kiss deep and fervent, a release of everything we had suppressed in the hours we spent apart. I felt his hands on my waist, pulling me closer, grounding me in a moment that felt both reckless and inevitable. But then the door burst open. Andrew stood in the doorway, his face pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. For a moment the world seemed to freeze. William and I pulled apart, panic and guilt flooding every inch of my being. Ruby, Andrew said, his voice trembling, barely able to form the words. What is this? I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. William stepped forward, his expression defiant, protective. It's not what it looks like, William began, but Andrew's sharp, bitter laugh cut him off. Oh, I think it's exactly what it looks like, Andrew spat, his voice rising. My wife. My nephew. How long has this been going on? Before I could answer, Julia's voice rang out from behind Andrew. What's going on? She stepped into the room, her gaze darting between us. When realization dawned, her face crumpled, and she let out a shaky breath. No, Ruby. Tell me this isn't true. The confrontation that followed was a maelstrom of shouting, accusations, and tears. Julia turned on me, her voice raw with betrayal. You were supposed to help him, guide him. Not. She couldn't finish the sentence, her words dissolving into sobs. Andrew stood by, his fury simmering beneath a cold, detached veneer. You've destroyed this family, he said quietly, his words cutting deeper than any shout could have. William tried to defend me, to explain, but every attempt only fueled the fire. You've both betrayed us, Andrew declared. You have no place in this house anymore. The finality in his voice was a blow I hadn't anticipated, but it was William who bore the brunt of their anger. The next morning, he packed his belongings in silence. I watched from the doorway, my heart breaking with every item he placed in his bag. I'll call you, he said softly, his hand lingering on mine. I nodded, unable to speak, knowing that words wouldn't ease the pain of this moment. A week passed in a haze of tension and regret. Andrew barely spoke to me, and when he did, his words were sharp, laced with bitterness. Julia avoided me altogether. The house that had once been my haven now felt suffocating, every corner haunted by memories of William. One morning I packed a suitcase and left. I left Andrew, the house, and the life I had built within its walls. I found a small apartment downtown, sparse and modest, but it was mine. For the first time in years I felt free. That evening I called William. We met at a quiet cafe on the edge of town. William was already there when I arrived, sitting by the window, his gaze distant. When he saw me, he stood, his expression unreadable. Ruby, he said softly as I approached. We sat across from each other, the silence heavy with all the things we needed to say. I've left Andrew, I began, my voice steady. I'm staying in an apartment now. It's small, but it's enough for me. His eyes searched mine. Why are you telling me this? Because I love you, I said, the words spilling out before I could second-guess them. You make me feel alive, William. You've made me realize what I've been missing all these years. And if you feel the same, I want us to be together. For a moment he said nothing, his expression unreadable. Then he reached across the table and took my hand in his. I love you too, he said, his voice thick with emotion. But are you sure? This won't be easy. People will judge, they'll talk. Let them, I said firmly. I've spent too much of my life worrying about what people think. All I want now is to be with you. He smiled then, a slow, genuine smile that lit up his face. Then let's do it, he said. Together. A month later, William moved into my apartment. The adjustment was seamless, our days filled with laughter, shared meals, and the quiet comfort of simply being together. The scandal that had erupted in our family eventually faded into whispers, replaced by the reality of our happiness. Andrew filed for divorce, and Julia refused to speak to either of us. It hurt, but the love William and I shared made the pain bearable. One evening, as we sat on the balcony of our new home, watching the city lights twinkle below, William turned to me and said, "Do you regret any of it?" "Not a second," I replied, resting my head on his shoulder. And it was true. In William, I had found a second chance, a reason to embrace life with open arms. Whatever the world thought of us didn't matter.